Hey, what's up guys, and welcome to today's video. So I've decided to make the next load of my videos basically a series about some of the most common mistakes and errors that I see people making when it comes to martial arts training. And naturally some of these are obviously going to cross over into areas of general fitness and things like that as well. So I'm sure it will be very beneficial for you. Now I find that often kind of pointing out what not to do to people is a really good way of keeping mindful going into training so that you know what to do instead. These videos will be appearing mostly on my personal channel at youtube.com/GrantStevensMA, so please head over there and subscribe. I'm now creating regular content there as well as my Instagram channel. But with that being said, if there's a topic that you think would be really valuable to people, just let me know and I will see if I can create an episode around that as well. So this first episode is going to be about the common mistakes when training on the heavy bag. Now the reason that I wanted to create an episode upon this topic specifically is I see so much really questionable form, you could call it, at different gyms that I train at, that I thought this topic and this area warranted an episode all to itself. Now the benefits of using the heavy bag are just insane and hit so many areas that exceed way out of just combative arts. It strengthens numerous muscles of the torso, as well as building powerful shoulders, as well as being a full body resistance cardio workout, improving mobility and proprioception all at the same time. But in order to really reap the rewards of those benefits in their fullest capacity, we need to know how to work the bag effectively, and it will become clear as I approach the numerous points in this video that there's a kind of optimal balance, which is the area you want to focus in to make using the bag as effective as it can be for you. Now starting at point number one, and that's just basically that there's some people out there who have absolutely no business hitting the bag at all, meaning that they're a complete beginner with very little experience and trying to go full power on the bag. This is actually something that's really dangerous to do, and more often than not, these are people with a huge chip on their shoulder who are trying to apply maximum power to their already anti-technique. Now there was a guy at the Foundry Gym in Walsall the other day, which is somewhere I train quite regularly. My friend Vaughan calls these people jabronis, and basically it's the kind of people who you will spar against and within 30 seconds of the round they'll just kick you in the balls straight away. So there was this guy that was basically roided out of his mind and for some reason decided that he, in the middle of everybody training, he was going to sprint over to one of the big heavy bags, and he tried to deliver this like flying knee to the bag, which resulted in him just kind of rolling off the bag and actually falling onto his back, meaning that everyone in the gym kind of just stopped what they were doing and stared at him, and it was just really cringeworthy. So don't be one of those people. Before you go onto the bag, you should have a good grasp of technique and know how to punch before trying to apply more power to techniques. And it's that thing of basically just trying to be too advanced without having that foundation. So until you've basically got your really foundational techniques down, you want to just work on those. So this isn't just a tip for beginners either. There's also a lot of people who already quite used to training and stuff who could really do with going back to the basics and kind of working on their technique and their foundation a little bit more. Pushing the bag with your punches instead of snapping the punches off the bag. And this one can be quite difficult for people to understand, especially when they're just starting out. And the reason for that is the seemingly paradoxical way in which you have to twist at the waist, push your shoulders forward in order to apply power. So I noticed that when I've coached people to twist their body more in punching combos, especially when throwing a cross for instance, when I say this and explain there's kind of more that they could be getting out of that punch, they sometimes begin pushing the bag rather than snapping the punches off of the bag. So the power in the strikes comes from the transfer of energy throughout the entire body, starting with the feet, that eventually discharges through the fist at the end. So the punches have already been set into motion about 85% before the final extension of the arm. And this is the same with kicking techniques as well, although it's less spoken about. If you want to know more about this topic in depth, I did quite an extensive video on this topic, which I will list in the description below. The next part is about falling into the pitfall of having the heavy bag as the only thing that you're using to train yourself. Now I think part of the reason for this is because hitting the bag is really fun to do, and it also feels great. You get a good workout, all of those endorphins are released and things like that when you're doing it. But you need to remember that for martial artists there are a vast array of different areas to train in. Even pad work with a partner is more dynamic because the partner is able to throw strikes at you to initiate you to move around when you're training together. The heavy bag's obviously completely stationary and motionless, whereas an opponent is dynamic and obviously moves around a lot. Not only that, but they can also strike back towards you and learn to read your patterns, so there's just so many different variables to take into account. Even if you have absolutely no desire to become a competitive fighter as a martial artist, I think sparring can improve your skill level just 100-fold, and in my opinion is much better endurance training than hitting the bag or anything else for that matter, because you're forced to keep fighting against your opponent. There's no way you can just stop like when you use the bag for instance, because if you do that you're just going to get knocked down. The next point is about applying power into every single strike that you throw, which just makes you completely one-dimensional. Now this is something I see quite a lot, and I guess it depends on what you're actually using the heavy bag for. If you're doing like high intensity rounds of 30 seconds or something for developing fitness, then that's okay. But if you're using the heavy bag like most people to kind of develop and work on your combative art, then you want to think of it more like a game of chess, where you're carefully selecting the movements, in this case the punches, that you want to apply power to. Nobody can go for 12 rounds on a bag with every single shot with full power and intensity as well, and if anyone tells you they can, they're either not throwing enough strikes or they're just flat out lying. And this is how you're obviously going to fight somebody as well. You don't just go and blast people with a flurry of full power shots. You kind of pick the shots that you're going to use carefully. You use certain strikes like your jab to cause a reaction in your opponent to set up subsequent ones and so on. So you can imagine trying to apply max power to every single jab you do, for instance. Not only is it going to tire you fast, but it's going to leave you in a compromised position for your next strike because of the disruption in your center of gravity that's required to apply that power. Again, I think this is just one of those ego trip things where it screams just a lack of experience when you see people training like this. Now this next point is the opposite of the last one, and that's not applying enough power into your strikes. So there's too much power and then there's not enough power. Remember I spoke about the optimal balance at the beginning of this video, and a lot of this just comes down to actually not really trying hard enough, unfortunately. It's natural that if you're not applying enough power into at least a portion of the total strikes you execute, then your body isn't going to benefit from the conditioning that it otherwise would do if you were doing that. It's something that I've spoken about countless times in videos on my channel as well as the Pioneer, but really the best way to condition yourself for an exercise or an activity is just by doing that activity again and again and again. However, with one very big caveat, which is that it needs to be done with a sufficient level of effort in which you push yourself regularly, but not constantly. Remember that balance, otherwise you just remain at the level you're currently at. I actually think this point is one of the main reasons that many martial artists have kind of stagnated at their current level of skill actually. And that's because they've become accustomed to training at a certain pace, and then when I train with them they get tired easily, and I'm thinking, you know, you're supposed to be a martial artist, why are you not fit enough to do the activity we're doing? Not enough intensity. And I wanted to stay away from using this word in the previous sections talking about power, because power and intensity are actually two different things, although there is some crossover in the middle. The way I like to think about intensity is more kind of like a high level view or theme that you carry into all of your training sessions. Now obviously there's many different ways that you can use the bag, and I'm certainly not saying there's only one way to use it, but I am talking in general terms of just progression here. So if we think about the word intensity kind of like a container in which all of your training takes place, and within that container can be many different elements. You can be really intense without putting in any power at all and just work on volume of strikes and speed, for instance, or like I mentioned in the previous section, you can be working more upon developing power with fewer strikes, concentrating on technique, body position and so on. But these are both different examples of intensity. And the same also goes for too much intent as well, to where the person is not leaving any room for kind of freedom of expression and development of their own style. By this I mean constantly executing strikes without really considering what you're doing, and I think this is where people end up looking a bit robotic and one-dimensional. Something that also ties into this area is actually not hitting the bag enough to receive the sufficient conditioning benefits that you could otherwise get from it. So the strikes you're doing could be decent in power and technique, etc., but if they're so few and far between, as I said, you won't be getting the conditioning you would otherwise get with greater volume. And this leads nicely on to the next point, which is not getting your weight behind the strikes, or you could say kind of only using your arms to throw the punches. It's not really about applying power always, it's learning how to apply power more like. And this can be a weird one because again, there's a certain level of understanding about the mechanics of striking that's required if people have very limited experience, but even those with relatively decent technique otherwise can also fall victim to this when going onto a bag, for instance, and that's because of the change in environment, meaning that there's now a great big bag in front of you to contend with, and you have to adapt your technique from hitting pads or shadow boxing in order to work effectively. And this is something that's actually really important that I've not seen spoken much about. So a decent pad holder should provide equal resistance to the force of the punches that you're throwing, but even with a pad holder, there's no way that their arms are going to obviously be able to resist your strikes as much as a hard and a decent quality heavy bag. So there's a lot to contend with there, and this is applicable for everything you do, but especially for hook punches, for instance. The bag's much wider obviously than a person's head or the position in which your training partner will hold pads for you, and so you've got to adapt for these variables, and this can only really be gained through experience of the bag and finding out what works. It's also going to be different depending on your specific body type, so you'll have to find out the best way for you personally to apply power, but there are some general rules about this that are applicable globally to take into account. If you want a greater understanding about this topic, I made a video about kinetic linking and the mechanics of striking, so please check the link in the description. This next point ties in with the previous one I mentioned, and that's been really one-dimensional with almost little to no extra movement. Many people just stand in one position and execute the same strikes and combos continually when training on the bag, and at the same pace as well, with no rhythm or variation. So one of the purposes of the bag is learning to strike at different angles, how to move off centre line, circle an opponent and things like that. And this can be developed in numerous ways, but the one I would suggest is in shadow boxing, because obviously you've got the complete freedom to move around with no obstacles in your way to kind of find out what works and develop your own style. You can then take your ideas to the bag afterwards and try different things out, also ensuring to utilise different levels and not always punching at the same place all the time. This next point is mainly applicable to those fighting in competition, and that's using combinations that are unrealistic or not something that might happen in a real situation. So although we obviously don't want to have rehearsed routines that we always fall back on, naturally this is going to happen to an extent. Now we all have our go-to techniques no matter how advanced we are, so it pays for you to train yourself to fall back on ones that may give you the opportunity to get the upper hand. So if this point applies to you, then do ensure that you're training some combos that are naturally going to be quite realistic and go with your style of fighting, for instance. One of those would be this simple combo. The first 3 strikes will cause the opponent to lift their hands into a covered position, leaving an opening for the 4th body shot to land in the ribs, and subsequently then leaving them open for the kick afterwards, or whatever other applicable technique you want to execute. So those were some of the common mistakes that I've noticed throughout my time training that people tend to fall into when using the heavy bag. And as mentioned before, many of these areas come down to working within that fine balance, and a lot of the mistakes are actually the opposite of each other. For instance, not enough power and applying constant power. That sweet spot lies right in the middle, and you want to ensure that you're working within that point in order to get the most benefits from your training. There's loads of different things within this topic that I could have mentioned here, but I just thought these were some of the most common ones and some of the most important that I would mention and highlight that you want to watch out for in training. And also, if you have any other ideas for subsequent episodes in the Common Mistakes series, please let me know in the comments. Thanks very much guys, and I will see you next time.